We've been graduate students together years ago. Nice seeing you. And other grad students in the department. It is an honor to welcome Professor J. Kameron Carter back to the University of Virginia. When I first arrived on the scenes here 12 years ago, I can't believe it's been 12 years, 11 years ago, I was thrilled to be asked by Gene Rogers, your esteemed dissertation advisor, to join your dissertation committee at the very last stages. And that memorable afternoon, was it a dome room defense? Or I think so too, of the precocious, brilliant dissertation that became this groundbreaking book, Race: A Theological Account. I say memorable because Professor Willie Jennings, who was on the committee, who'd come up from Duke Divinity School, said, perhaps even during the defense, the words that Karl Barth used to describe Dietrich Bonhoeffer's doctoral dissertation come to mind. It was a theological miracle, eine theologische Überraschung, which can also mean like a shock, you know, but it also means a tour de force, and that was an extraordinary way for me both to make my way into the program, but also to begin a generative, inspiring 11-year theological friendship with Professor Carter. Those of you who are in the class know that throughout this rather intense semester, we have worked hard to identify and analyze the differing theological responses to Hitler. We have tried to trace doctrinal commitments and scriptural practices as they shape perceptions of Jews, other non-Aryans, homosexuals, disabled persons. We have looked for patterns and influences. We have, in a sense, done the work of lived theology by asking questions such as how are theological commitments displayed, professed, or kind of enacted in observed political and social life? How do theological convictions and commitments shape the everyday practices and patterns of everyday life, including gender and racial, economic, cultural, political organization? We've also tried to ask about the lessons that can be learned from these ponderous and harrowing texts that we've read and stories that we've learned. What lessons can be learned both to us as citizens, but also as students of theology. I'm delighted that you're speaking on this topic today, constructive Christian theology after the Holocaust. We have 2 more weeks of class, and you will sort of inspire us to do some of the hard work of sifting through this, landscape of infected theologies with only a shimmer of hope here and there on the theological side, and try to do some constructive normative work if that's possible. So, and those of you who haven't made it to these other lectures, those are all 4 are on the website and available to be seen, I guess, in MP3 format or video format. Professor Carter, many of you know, is a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. My wife Karen is a Philly girl, right behind you. Graduated from Temple University. Received a THM from Dallas Theological Seminary, and as I mentioned earlier, his doctorate here. On your website it says PhD, UVA. You have an MA too, right?
No, I did ATS
at Dallas. But you should have an MA from UVA, because when you pass your comps, you automatically get an MA. Yeah. This is a, do you have an MA?
I do, but
It has been a controversy since I was a grad student here, but I discovered, like in 1986, that according to university policy, when anyone, doesn't matter whether you have 5 MAs already, when you pass comprehensive exams here, you have earned an MA. So all you have to do, if you want that MA, you get a diploma in the mail, is go to the registrar, call them, fill out the form, and they should send it to you. It's outrageous that you don't have your MA. Yeah, I know you want it. I mean, it's something else to put on that wall. Too much work. This extraordinary work, Race: A Theological Account, has, and Professor Carter's presence at Duke Divinity School have made Duke one of the most exciting theological centers in the world. I would say currently it ranks as the second best center of theology and ethics in the world. Yeah, some might dispute this. It seems like we send you guys about 10 or 15 undergraduates every year to Divinity School. There must be 30 or 40 students there. This book, just very briefly, investigates the complex forms of identity that have come to mark us all. And in this book, it's an extraordinary work, and we've read sections from this today. Professor Carter explored the multiple legacies implicated in the production of a racialized world, the legacies of colonialism and empire, political theories of the state, anthropological theories of the human, and philosophy itself. I mean, this book burst on the scene and has been a subject of intense debate, journal symposia, made you kind of a rock star, I suppose. And currently, you're working on a very exciting new project that's under contract with Yale University Press, Fugitive Life, subtitle, Counter History of Political Theology. We are so delighted to have you back at UVA, and I hope you feel comfortable back here. We're going to have a good time today. It's Professor McDowell stepping in, Deborah McDowell, esteemed literary theorist and memoirist from the great state of Alabama. We're going to have a good time tonight, too. So we're going to go about 50 minutes. We'll take a break, have some coffee, and then come back for a time of Q&A for maybe 45 minutes or an hour. So that's enough rambling around on my part. Here's your check right here, too, by the way. I've forgotten that so many times. I like have it in my pocket.
I am very, very happy, very pleased to be here, and it is a kind of homecoming. And getting to see many, many familiar faces, many new faces, it is just good to be here. To see colleagues and friends, people I went to grad school with, Professor Geddes, teachers, Professor McDowell, Professor Marsh, and most of all of you students. Students are the reason I got into this. And I love being a student so much, I wanted to work with students. Well, I am like I said, very pleased to be here. I have been asked to speak on the subject. Let me make sure I'm putting this in right. I was putting in the wrong code. My computer was saying, I'm not opening up. Okay, good, I got it now. I've been asked to speak on this theme to contribute to the conversation of your course this semester. Your course is Theology in the Third Reich. And I've been asked to talk with you, to speak with you, to have a conversation about the possibilities of constructive theology. Great. The possibilities of constructive theology after the Holocaust. Okay. Now I should say I printed this out and I marked up things I needed to correct, and I'll be doggone, I left it on my desk in my office. So I just have this here, and I already know that this has some typos in it. So if you would just bear with me, there might be places where I need to back up and then just fix up. But hopefully I'll be clear enough. I'm good. I'm good. Some of this I'm going to talk out and then read through, and some of it I'm going to talk about extemporaneously as well. Okay, over the next 50 minutes or so, I want to linger, as it were, in the groove of a problem. The problem of constructive. Can we say the problem of reconstructive theology? Reconstructing theology. Christian theology is that mode of theology I'm going to talk about mainly here. Reconstructing Christian theology after the Holocaust. What does it mean to do Christian theology after? I have this italicized here because I want to play with this after a little bit. After the Holocaust. What does it mean to theologically say never again? Theologically, I have that italicized too, say never again. These are the questions before us. And they are challenging questions because of the form that they're given to us, the form that they're asked. They're questions that in asking about theology's aftermath, as it were, they are questions that ask after and look for a theology, shall we say, in the open. They ask for and inquire into theology's future. They inquire perhaps into theology as a discourse about a clearing for a future. These questions, what does it mean to do constructive theology after the Holocaust? To do theology as a discourse of the never again? These questions inquire into theology precisely as a mode of discourse that in the wake of genocidal catastrophe is yet to come. These questions, in short, ask after a theology in the mode of futurity, theology as a future project, a project that is always already ahead of itself, ahead of us. I'm thinking of Derrida's notion about how philosophy needs to be avenir, a philosophy to come. And therefore, to think about theology in this way, to inquire about a project whose relationship to the order of things is a relationship that's also criminal from the order of things. It's fugitive from the order of things. My interest in this question about theology's aftermath, its afterlife, its fugitive life after the Holocaust, is an inquiry about theology's relationship not just to the 20th century historical event, the historical happening of the Jewish Holocaust. I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in something a little more than that. Rather, my interest in this question of theology's aftermath, its afterlife, of theology after the Holocaust, is about the Holocaust as a kind of nodal point, a kind of flashpoint. I'm thinking here of Walter Benjamin, a kind of flashpoint that allows the possibility of glimpsing a wider circuitry, a larger economy of which the Holocaust gives us a glimpse into. Like Giorgio Agamben, but also and significantly not like him, I want to read this wider economy, this 20th century flashpoint, as a problem rooted in theology itself. In other words, I want to read it as a problem of political theology and of theological economy. But to make such an inquiry, to press towards a mode of theological fugitivity, if I can put it that way, requires an interrogation of theology's own implicatedness and complicity in the Shoah, so as to imagine a mode of theology that is in fact beyond itself. And that is my main interest today. Theology beyond itself. Theology after itself, presuming this is possible. And if I may just put my cards on the proverbial table, I want to argue it's possible, but with great strain and difficulty. Fugitive theology is my interest. What this could possibly mean or entail is at the heart of my inquiry today. And here I return to the metaphor with which I open these remarks, the metaphor of the groove, by which I mean both the cut in a wooden beam, as it were, but also the groove as in a musical connotation, right? To linger in the groove of modern theology is to linger upon these questions. And to linger upon these questions requires coming to terms with the degree to which contemporary theology has arguably reached a kind of, in my estimation at least, plateau, perhaps a kind of exhaustion in its efforts towards a non-supersessionist theological discourse. However, because Christian theology from the second half of the 20th century up until the dawning years of the 21st century has been an extended exercise in trying to enact a post-Holocaust Christian imagination, that we've reached a kind of plateau, perhaps a kind of exhaustion, may not be evident to us. In what follows, I intend to linger in the cut and within the groove carved out by the Shoah within modernity itself, and more specifically within Western modernity. That's to say, sliding my intellectual finger within the groove, but against the grain of the groove of the Holocaust, the Shoah, I want to move my finger across the groove in a way that's unexpected. I aim to remember the Shoah differently. For when it comes to the Holocaust, as Toni Morrison has taught us in so many ways, when it comes to modernity more broadly, it is memory that is at stake for us. Memory. I'm going to play a lot with this memory stuff. As prolegomena to Christian theology after the Holocaust, I want to argue here for a different memory, a different memorializing, a different remembering, putting back together of the Holocaust itself by way of a different memory, a different memorializing, and a different remembering of modern theology itself. Okay, great, skipping on down. In remembering the Holocaust differently, that is within the cut and in the groove, but against the grain of that groove, I want to think toward a post-Holocaust Christian theology, one that remembers differently. I want to situate the Holocaust and thus constructive theology after the Holocaust between modernity's racial imaginary on the one hand and on the other, decolonization, or what my Duke colleague Walter Mignolo has called the decolonial option. The payoff, I hope at least, of this exercise is that out of this different memory of the Holocaust, a counter history of theology itself, a counter history of political theology will emerge. In carrying out this exercise, this effort to re-theorize the Holocaust and to theologize in a post-Holocaust direction, I would like to establish an interlocution in order to pull this off. I want to establish an interlocution between the theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer and the Francophone poet, playwright, and politician from Martinique, Aimé Césaire. I shall engage writings by these two figures I would like to engage writings from these two figures spanning the early 1940s to the early 1950s, and thus spanning the beginnings of the Jewish death camps and the Second World War and the aftermath of that war, or the immediate post-Shoah years. My goal is nothing less than globalizing, spatializing afresh in a different way, the Judenfrage. And thus, by globalizing and thereby to globalize and spatialize afresh theology itself. I aim to do this by relating, indeed by establishing, what might be called a kind of multi-directionality, a multi-directional relay between the Holocaust, modernity, coloniality, and their post-Shoah, post-colonial, or better still, their decolonial aftermaths. I want to consider theology, particularly its imagining of the human, as a kind of relay mechanism, as a kind of operation that has fueled the relation between Holocaust, colonialism, and their aftermaths. So I'm trying to get inside of the vision of the human that I think subtends and links together the phenomenon of Holocaust, phenomenon of raciality, phenomenon of coloniality. At the heart of this theopolitical operation of the human is a story of Black Jewish relatedness that is part and parcel of what may be called a structure of global antagonisms. and I want to further contend, I don't have this here, the structure of global antagonisms by which Black-Jewish relationality is kind of linked together is tied to this kind of figure I want to talk about, Western man. Before delving into and trying to clarify my argument to you, and I should say, I have this actually parenthetically here, and heck, for that matter, to myself, that was supposed to be funny. It's worth entertaining the question, why an interlocution between such unlikely figures as Bonhoeffer and Césaire? The former, Bonhoeffer, an elite German intellectual situated at the heart of one of the West's key metropolitan centers, Berlin. The other from Martinique, an island of the Caribbean archipelago, the Antilles, an island that within the time frame in question was a French colonial holding and even today is not fully independent, being a French department, the Department of France. The former, again, Bonhoeffer, a theologian shaped in the tradition of Cultur Protestantismus, a figure whom the aged Adolf von Harnack, with one foot in the proverbial grave, virtually handpicked to carry the mantle, Elisha-like, of modern theology into the 20th century, to be, in other words, modern theology's, parenthetically, great white hope. The other, Césaire, who, unlike so many of his fellow islanders, actually did escape the archipelago to be educated as a classicist at France's prestigious universities. Why an interlocution between these figures? The short answer is that, as I've recently argued with respect to Karl Barth and W.E.B. Du Bois regarding World War I and the post-war aftermath around the Treaty of Versailles, Césaire and Bonhoeffer are in fact, from different vantage points, coming at the same problem. The problem of the crisis of the West, and more specifically, its vision of humanism, the human, with the vision of humanism, the human that subtends this, around the flashpoint in Bonhoeffer's case of the Jewish question in Germany, and in Césaire's case around fascism as it was being exported back into Martinique. Further still, and this is perhaps the greatest reason I seek an interlocution between them, they both sought to provide a new genealogy of memory on the Jewish question, in which the discourse of theology played a crucial role. Now, when it comes to Bonhoeffer scholarship, and somewhat in Barth studies as well, this is not a shocking claim. That is Bonhoeffer dealing with theology and trying to reimagine theology. For Bonhoeffer scholarship has noted that Bonhoeffer started to give voice, as John DeGrucci notes in his comments, the critical addition to the Letters and Papers from Prison, that Bonhoeffer was invested in a new theology, trying to come up with a new theology. And while this new theology, a theology for a world come of age, a theology for a religionless Christianity, as Bonhoeffer calls it, these are just two of his memorable phrases, he was already struggling towards expressing, even earlier on, this new theology in the beginning of the 40s, in the ethics. You'll recall that Bonhoeffer imagined the ethics as providing a theological imaginary that might guide a post-war Germany, certainly, and I would argue, even a post-war West. My point for now is that Bonhoeffer contended that addressing the so-called Jewish problem requires addressing the deeper crisis of the West as a crisis of the human, the crisis of Western humanism. That's what I want to argue about Bonhoeffer. And this too, and hence the reason for the interlocution that I'm interested in developing, this too was the concern of the Francophone intellectual Aimé Césaire. At the same time as Bonhoeffer was wrestling with understanding the condition of his homeland, to the point when in 1939 he was invited to come back to the United States to ride out the war, but he refused to do so. At the same time that this was happening, Césaire was wrestling with similar problems. He too was trying to come to terms with the condition of the Western world, the condition of Martinique in the Western world, in relationship to the Western world in the late 1930s and 1940s. It was during this time in his homeland that Martinique had come under Vichy rule, the Vichy regime, which had basically given in to Hitler. He too was trying to understand the significance of this for the Western world. Césaire too wanted to understand such questions in relationship to the Jewish question as it had roiled Europe. But alas, he too sought to understand the significance of this problem for the European imaginary with crucial echoes of modernity's theological discourse, or the discourse of theology, in view. I want to argue, as I proceed, that Bonhoeffer and Césaire meet at the crucible of theological discourse in their efforts to memorialize and remember the crisis of the middle of the 20th century. I should also say this. My reading of Césaire, and perhaps even of the French Negritude movement, which fueled so much of 1960s decolonization efforts around the globe, is somewhat unconventional, in that I seek to open research in this field, that is the field of Black studies more broadly, to theological inquiry and questions as they bear upon colonized and post-colonial and decolonial subjectivities and political and social formations. Consequently, this talk represents an intervention, at least the beginnings of one, I hope, into Black studies, an intervention that wants to raise the question of religion and theology in relationship to the futures, plural, of Blackness. But again, I must circle back and quickly add and say that this Césaire Bonhoeffer interlocution is not just an intervention into Black studies that aims to bring questions of religion and theology into consideration and into view on questions of Blackness. It is an intervention into theological studies around questions of constructive theology in a post-Shoah, post-Holocaust key, and with Bonhoeffer, for purposes of this presentation at least, as the flashpoint. The intervention here is both to celebrate Bonhoeffer, and I always get nervous when I start saying this, and with an eminent Bonhoeffer scholar in the room, I'll take my chance though. The intervention here is both to celebrate Bonhoeffer as making significant contributions in the direction of a post-Christian Christian theology, if I may put it that way, a Christian theology after itself, a Christian theology in the mode of fugitivity and futurity, but I also want to problematize some of the genuflections around Bonhoeffer. I want to be clear. Bonhoeffer, he says, I read him, was a bourgeois German intellectual. He wanted to interrupt, but also was captured by the imagination of Western man. He clearly wrestled with his own formation. And I would say parenthetically, this is deeply something theologians would learn well from him in doing today. And yet, the future he imagined for theology, while helpful in some regards, was still captured and captivated by the vision of Western humanism, even as he's trying to escape. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit as we proceed further. This certainly is the case with the ethics. And if there is reason to celebrate the letters and papers from prison, I contend it's because it gives us insight into what it would mean to escape that imaginary, the imaginary of Western man functioning as a surrogate God man. Western man functioning as a surrogate God man. This is very crucial. And here is where Césaire returns into the picture. For it is Césaire, so I want to suggest, who in the register of the poetic, I'm thinking here of his Cahiers, the Cahiers notebook of a return to the native land, makes precisely the crucial theological moves. I want to suggest that there's a kind of theological impulse subterranean to this text. Makes the crucial theological moves, indeed the Christological and pneumatological moves, that Bonhoeffer's entire oeuvre, certainly from the time of his year-long venture into the Black Atlantic by way of Harlem in the 1930s, sought to realize. Okay, let's go to the discourse on colonialism, Césaire's 1950s text, to try and begin to set up the problem a little bit more. We'll see how far I get into this. And so, I'd like to begin with Césaire's important poetic text, Discourse on Colonialism. For I want to argue that this text suggests necessary conditions for theological work for a Christian imagination after Christianity, and the provocations for the arguments I want to make in this direction in light of Césaire's text, suggest a new mode of memory work around the Holocaust. Aimé Césaire, who died just a short time ago, only in 2008, being the only person of African descent to have been admitted, not without cultural consternation I might add, into the French pantheon of literary and cultural figures of the nation, wrote Discourse on Colonialism in 1950. He was a young writer, a politician who had emerged from World War II as a leading exponent of the emergent French negritude movement. Like many from France's colonial outposts across Africa and in the Antilles, Césaire spent most of the 1930s in Paris, where he studied at two of France's most prestigious educational institutions, the Lycée Louis le Grand and, as already mentioned, the École Normale Supérieure. With many diasporic Black intellectuals, he was very involved in the cultural scene, writing poetry, writing essays, political tracts. He returned to Martinique in 1939, still a subject of the French Empire. And soon thereafter, he published the first version of his best-known poem, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. I'll return shortly, have a couple comments about Césaire's important poem, but first, more must be said to set the context for understanding Césaire's discourse and its significance for theology trying to imagine itself after the Holocaust. And this further context revolves around Martinique, which, though small in geographical size, was by no means marginal to the drama of world history at the middle of the 20th century. I mentioned that Césaire returned to the island of Martinique in 1939, but it's also worth noting that the ship on which he made the voyage from Paris, on its return back to Europe, was sunk by the Nazis. Further still, racist French soldiers had subjected his homeland, his island, to the Vichy regime, which was working in tandem with Hitler. In short, Césaire's return to Martinique was a return to a virulent racism inflected by fascism. A virulent racism inflected by fascism. Césaire clashed with the Vichy government in Martinique and eventually produced with his wife, Suzanne Césaire, and the philosopher René Menal, the journal Tropique, which only furthered the clashes. The journal was in production between 1941 and 1945 and really functioned sort of like a form of cultural critique and cultural resistance to Vichy rule in Martinique. The noted historian Robin D.G. Kelly observes that Tropique is marked by the evolution of a sophisticated anti-colonial stance as well as a vision of a post-colonial future. Kelly further observes that Tropique put forward a vision of freedom that drew on modernism and a deep appreciation for pre-colonial African modes of thought and practice. Kelly says that it drew on surrealism as the strategy of revolution of the mind, and Marxism as revolution of the productive forces. And yet, it was an effort to carve out a position that was independent of these forces. There are two vital things here, for my purposes at least, that I would like for us to keep in mind. First is the revolutionary project that the Césaires, both Suzanne and Amy, were striving to realize. Yes, I'm sorry, this is one of the things I was trying to mop up and I left on my desk. First is the revolutionary project that the Césaires were striving to realize. What must be borne in mind is that this project was an effort to respond to how Martinique, but also how the Antilles more broadly and Blackness more specifically, had come to be situated at the crossroads of a host of contending forces. There were the forces of European fascism, exerting itself not just in Europe, right, but now across the Atlantic, through the Atlantic networks. And then there were the forces of racism, by which fascism made itself felt on the island. Further still, there were the forces of war, pressing on the island, to say nothing of the island's relationship to the United States, by which it served as a kind of stopping point for French refugees trying to escape Europe and make their way to the US, even though the island's black inhabitants could not escape. One of these refugees would have a lasting influence on Césaire himself, the surrealist writer and poet André Breton. Another of these refugees was Claude Lévi-Strauss. Martinique, in other words, is a geographical, it's a geopolitical, and it's a geocultural site where center and periphery, where metropoles and colonies, culture and violence, colonialism and modernity, genocide and life management, the management of the body / the body politic, in short, where barbarism and civilization, Benjamin again, meet. Second thing to hold in mind, Césaire, or more properly again, the Césaires, is involved in a project that aims towards a future that is not reducible either to what the political right had to offer or to what they took to be the most viable possibilities that the left had to offer, namely surrealism and Marxism. Césaire sought to make use of surrealism as a poetic and literary form and Marxism as a mode of political and economic critique. But he sought to enact an imagination that exceeded the sum of these parts. And finally, and this is crucial specifically for understanding discourse on colonialism, Césaire is involved in a project reminiscent of W.E.B. Du Bois's, in which the French Negre, the French black, like the U.S. Negro, came to be marked by a different kind of consciousness in relationship to Europe and in relationship to modernity at large. This different consciousness was one in which an understanding of the situation that is Europe, and let's be clear, Europe is not an essence, it's a situation. That Europe as a situation came to be refracted through the situation that is Martinique. Out of this doubled consciousness, this kind of second sight, this different mode of looking on the world and understanding the world, Césaire, in his discourse, articulates the Caribbean situation or reality of modernity's archipelagos and France and Europe together with each other. That's to say, he brings together various forms of European violence, including colonialism and the Nazi brutality of the Holocaust. He reads these realities in deep relationship to each other by bringing together colonialism and genocide. Césaire dares to read these modes of violence through each other. Okay, great. Oh, yeah, I was gonna skip this, don't skip this. That is to say, in staging an encounter between colonialism and genocide, the Holocaust in this case, Césaire brings into view, and this is, I think, his real push, another violent encounter, namely the encounter of Europe with itself. Césaire calls this latter encounter, Europe's encounter with itself, the result of a kind of boomerang effect. In French, it's a choc en retour, a kind of choc au retour, the shock of a return. The task then of his discourse is to challenge Europe's self-understanding with a view to opening up another vantage point on the genocidal Holocaust against the Jews. What I would like to do at this point is say a little more about Césaire's development of this claim, his development of his particular viewpoint on Europe and thereby on the Holocaust. More specifically, I want to suggest that discourse is a kind of genealogical text, whose aim is not just to envision the Holocaust as a mode of violence internal to Europe and colonialism, and internal to the situation of the Antillean archipelagos, to Africa and beyond, but rather to see these as sutured all together. And now I want to risk shifting the metaphor to begin to theorize how, in being together, what the articulating hinge is that holds together these modes of violence. I want to suggest that Césaire starts to point to modernity's theological imaginary and its social-political operations as just that hinge, that mechanism that sutures together these various forms of violence that he's pulling together in this text. Césaire starts to zero in on the specific theologic, the logic of political theology, by means of which coloniality, raciality, along with anti-Semitism, has worked. My contention, when all is said and done, is that it is this political theology that Césaire is wrestling with and is disclosing by way of the metaphor of the boomerang effect, and that beyond discourse, and most especially in his poetic enactment of a different mode of return, in his notebook of a retour again, to the native land, he gives voice to a counter-history of political theology, and thus to what could be the beginnings of a post-Holocaust theological imagination. A little bit more about the discourse on colonialism. Early on in discourse, Césaire Césaire sought to make sense of the recent Nazi genocide against the Jews. At the heart of that genocide, Césaire argues, was Hitler, but was not Hitler. It was what he calls Hitlerism. But before expounding exactly what he means by Hitlerism, Césaire first offers a long, it's very long, it's German sentence long. It's very long, but it's profoundly elegant. Offers this long sentence, opening sentence, in which he describes European colonial atrocities with wide-ranging spatial and geographical reach. His description is designed to connect what I earlier called, invoking Benjamin, barbarism and civilization, or what Césaire himself links together as civilizing, as in civilizing mission, civilizing and decivilizing. He says, and I'm going to quote him at length because the whole sentence is this long. He says this: first, we must study how colonization works to decivilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word, to degrade him, to awaken him to buried instincts, to covetousness, violence, race hatred, and moral relativism. And we must show that each time a head is cut off or an eye put out in Vietnam and in France, they accept the fact. Each time that a little girl is raped, and in France, they accept the fact. Each time a Madagascan is tortured, and in France, they accept the fact. Civilization acquires another dead weight, a universal regression. I'm gonna come back to this word, dead weight and universal regression. It'll be very important because he's gonna pick it back up in the poetic text, Notebook of a Return. Civilization acquires another dead weight, a universal regression takes place, a gangrene sets in, a center of infection begins to spread, and that at the end of all these treaties that have been violated, all these lies that have been propagated, all these punitive expeditions that have been tolerated, all these prisoners who have been tied up and interrogated. I mean, you hear the rhythm, you can hear the rhyming. I mean, he's a poet, been interrogated. All these patriots who've been tortured, all at the end of all the racial pride that has been encouraged, all the boastfulness that has been displayed, a poison has been distilled into the veins of Europe And slowly but surely, the continent proceeds towards savagery. End quote. This quite long, even gargantuan sentence, labyrinthine sentence, which seeks to match in its movements from the French metropole to Vietnam and Madagascar, the very length and breadth of French and indeed Western imperial history, is, in my estimation at least, a kind of rhetorical work of art. In it, he embraces not only the global reach of imperialism, but indeed its effects on bodies. He notes the rape of girls and the torturing of dissidents. In noting the rape of girls as torturing of dissidents, Césaire notes that what he has described represents a profound pathology, a sickness within the very consciousness of Europe, a gangrene, as he calls it, a poison injected intravenous-like into Europe's veins, very veins, with the result that Europe, in its will to power, through the exporting of its civilization, in this very process, has undergone a decivilizing and thus descending into savagery, quote unquote. Europe is not, in other words, unaffected by imperialism. But how does this descent into savagery take place? How does the transformation of Europe take place? For to this point, in his opening description of the brutalities of colonial violence, Césaire has confined his narrative to the colonies. The brutalities of colonial violence do not take place, it would seem to be, in the metropolitan centers. Césaire argues that it takes place by means of a kind of boomerang effect. To quote him, "And then one fine day, the bourgeoisie is awakened by a terrific boomerang effect, choc en retour. The Gestapos are busy, the prisons fill up, the torturers standing around the racks invent, refine, discuss." Césaire further says, "People are surprised, they become indignant. They say," as I just read, "how strange, but never mind, it's Nazism, it will pass." And they wait, and they hope, and they hide the truth from themselves, that it is barbarism, the truth from themselves that it is barbarism, the supreme barbarism, the crowning barbarism that sums up all the daily barbarisms, that it is Nazism, yes, but that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices, that they tolerated Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, they shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples, that they have cultivated that Nazism, that they are responsible for it, that before engulfing the whole edifice of Western Christian civilization in its reddened waters, it oozes, seeps, and trickles from every crack. End quote. Césaire looks at the recent Nazi atrocities, the Holocaust, and so forth, from the vantage point of colonial violence. He wants to think the Jewish question in relationship to the colonial question. That is to say, he connects anti-Semitic violence against the Jews as Europe's internal other to violence against what we might call colonial violence, violence against Europe's colonial subjects abroad. There's a kind of homology between internal violence and external violence, right? He's almost giving us a kind of global reading of violence. With this opening salvo, Césaire meant to account for the Holocaust. What he said early in the earlier quote I just gave, how strange it is to those internal to Europe. What they name as strange, he wants to give it a kind of everydayness to help you see how ubiquitous it is actually. Césaire called, therefore, for a mode of what I would like to say is complex memory to be brought to bear on the recent genocidal atrocities against the Jews and for our understanding of the war itself. Indeed, Césaire is suggesting here that Nazism itself, and therefore the Jewish Holocaust, be understood in its imperial dimensions, right? but not just its imperial dimensions. Yes, but not just its imperial dimensions. It must be understood in relationship to the production and sustaining of global racial subjectivities. Global racial subjectivity. It's very important. I mean, we're pausing here because often we think about, the brutality of the Holocaust and the genocide of the Holocaust against the Jews. We tend to think of that quite often. Increasingly, scholarship is starting to expand it out, but quite often the typical ways in which we think about this is a very kind of Europeanized, one might say, Eurocentric way. What Césaire is doing is trying to burst open the imagination of how we think about this atrocity. He wants to globalize the racial framework in which we tend to think about it. In order to make this case, Césaire samples from the colonial archive. Césaire moves to establish a kind of homology between Europe's long-standing treatment of its colonial subjects and the treatment of Europe's Jews. The link between the two modes of violence is what Césaire calls Hitlerism. This is his name for that distinct mode of being called Europe. This is very important. Hitlerism is Europe. And therefore, Hitler was an instantiation of Europe. Hitler, that is, Hitlerism, has been speaking, Césaire says, for a very long time. He and it, Hitler and Hitlerism, and parenthetically I have here, the he or the masculinism of this is actually very important. This is also a very gendered and sexuality-driven discourse too. He and it, Hitler, Hitlerism, was speaking, Césaire says, to quote him, through the mouths of the Sarauts and the Bards, the Mullers and the Renans, and it's Renan, through the mouths of all those who considered and consider it lawful to apply to non-European peoples a kind of expropriation for public purposes for the benefit of nations that were stronger and better equipped. It was already Hitler speaking, end quote. Given the long-standing way in which Europe has operated in relationship to non-Europeans, only now compounded with the violence meted out within its own borders, Césaire's contention is not just that the Nazi crisis is indefensible. Hitlerism itself, which is to say, Europe, is indefensible. But as Césaire says on virtually page 1 of his discourse, to say simply that Europe is indefensible, which is a quote from him on opening pages, to say Europe is indefensible in itself is still not yet serious enough. What is serious is to recognize that Europe is, to quote him, morally, and perhaps even more pointedly for my purposes, spiritually, he says, indefensible. Spiritually indefensible. You have to think about what this means. Europe, which he also terms Hitlerism, is the name of a spiritual conundrum and crisis. Europe is a spiritual crisis, is what he's arguing. It is the name of a spiritual crisis with geospatial and temporal reach. It has a reach that descends not just planetary wide, but into consciousness itself. It reaches and constructs subjectivities. Césaire then starts to suggest, and again on these opening pages, the nature of this spiritual crisis that is Hitlerism, Europe. The crisis wherein an equation has been established between colonization and civilization. That spiritual link is, Césaire says, Christianity, or to put a sharper point on it, following the work of such scholars, contemporary scholars as Gil Anijar and Tomoko Masuzawa, it is Western Christianity. That's to say, it's that form of Christianity that once went under the name Christendom wherein, in that form of Christianity, an equation had been established between Christianity and the Western world. To say Christianity was to say the West. Césaire calls this to quote him, a dishonest equation in which Christianity equals civilization, paganism, which equals savagery. That's the equation, the dishonest equation. Christianity equals civilization, paganism. Some are civilized, others are pagan, right? Which equals savagery, which, if we follow the math equation all the way through, we can just say, on Césaire's reading, Christianity now equals savagery. From this equation, there could not but ensue, he says, abominable colonialist and racist consequences, whose victims were to be the yellow peoples and the Negroes, and finally, the Jews of Europe itself. Now, let's go a little further with this. We on the same page, right? Okay, cool. That Césaire took very seriously the fact that Europe is indefensible because Hitlerism is indefensible. That he took very seriously, that Hitlerism is indefensible because religion, European religiosity, it's spiritually indefensible. And that he took that Europe and Hitlerism and spirituality, European spirituality, was indefensible, ties to the fact that he took Homo modernus, modern man, and Homo religiosus to be indefensible, and that all of this was indefensible because Homo Christianus, Christian man, is indefensible. That he took all of this seriously as indefensible is further established in a powerful moment in the discourse. The moment in the discourse when he talks about a guy named Georges Bidault. Bidault was the French prime minister during the Malagasy uprising. Madagascar was one of the French colonial holdings. Bidault was the French prime minister during the Malagasy uprising and led the Fourth Republic at the start of the Indochina War. He was the representative of French sovereignty. He was the prime minister. He was the representative of French sovereignty. He showed up in the colonies. You were looking at France. That's who he was. In his critique of Bidault, Césaire says in discourse that the French prime minister, and this is a quote, looked like a communion wafer dipped in shit. Now come on, y'all. That's good. Come on. That's good. Communion wafer dipped in shit. Now that's her dipped in blood, but okay, got you. Besides being provocative, to say the least, Césaire's language here cuts to the quick of his critique of colonialist discourse, which has returned to Europe with a vengeance. On the one hand, the image affirms a dictum of political theology, namely the homology between the political sovereign and his soteriological political representative and God. The homology between the political sovereign and God. French prime minister shows up, and he invokes this communion language with respect to him. And then already, I'm trying to suggest, just invoking that imagery, he's already now pushing inside of what I want to call the problem of political theology as a global imperial problem. You already hear why I'm not a Gomban at this point, who has virtually nothing to say in all of his rhetoric about political theology, about imperialism on the one side and slavery on the other. What's up with that? Anyway, I digress. And yet, Césaire, rather than sacralizing this imagery, he profanes it. In effect, he suggests through this imagery of, again, pardon my French, the shittiness of the communion wafer as linked to imperial rule and to a European imperial war against subjected and supposedly inferior peoples, that against that savagery and pardon, back up. In effect, he suggests through this imagery that savagery and decivilization are at work. That's what he's suggesting. Savagery and decivilization in the person of the Prime Minister, Georges Bidault, is the crucial thing here. Bidault, in this kind of moment, this kind of sacral, profaned moment, Bidault is made to mine and to spread civilization as decivilization, and thus to establish right, even if they are forced relations among people groups and cultures across the planet. He's the representative of a false communion, in other words. He enforces a false communion. But to look at the Prime Minister is to be looking at the same time at a mimicry of Jesus Christ. You're looking at a mimicry of the Messiah, an imperial Christ, what I've taken to calling the imperial God-man, who would by force, and indeed enforce, civilization and thus bring about, shall we say, the body of Christ as a false or problematic communion or community, as a kind of false eschaton, a false kingdom of God, the content of which is Europe. All of this is what Césaire means by Hitlerism. In other words, Hitlerism is a spiritual problem. It's spiritually indefensible. It's a religious problem. More specifically, it's a theological problem. We could go even further. It's a Christological problem. It's soteriological, and it's grounded in suturing Western man to the image of a God-man. This is not just the practice of colonialism, it's his underwriting discourse. That discourse that makes it seem natural and just right. Okay. May I suggest further still? May I ask you before I suggest further still, what kind of time I'm looking at?
Got 8 or 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm good, okay.
Whatever time you need.
All right, okay. Let me just go a little bit further because I don't want to weary people's patience either. I want to suggest that Césaire has taken us far, indeed far, into the problem of Hitlerism, the Holocaust, and related matters. He suggested that at the center of the Holocaust is a boomerang effect that is returned home to Europe. And that this boomerang effect has subtending it a kind of Christian theological discourse that has material realities, material effects in the world. He's materializing the way in which Christian discourse looks. He's trying to show you how it operates in the world. And indeed, this Christian theological discourse in its materiality has soteriological and Christological features to it. I would put it this way. Hitlerism and the Holocaust, the crisis that is Europe taken seriously, is a new manifestation of the Christological problem, the problem of a false God-man. This is the problem. Here I will borrow from Giorgio Agamben for a second to use Agamben's most recent theorizations. This is the problem now of theological economy. But more specifically, it is the problem of Christological economy, the economy of man vying to be God-man. But it is as such also the problem of political theology, the problem of the homology established between the will to Western sovereign rule and its aspirations in this rule toward divinity. It is this homology, this problem of political theology that's underwritten European modernity and coloniality. Césaire's suggestion then is that the Jewish question is not outside of a series of theological concerns. Rather, it is internal to a series of theological concerns. Okay, in the interest of time, let me just just give you a thumbnail then of the second and the third move that I sort of want to make because I don't have enough time to do it all. It's here that basically I turn to Bonhoeffer because I want to suggest I've been reading, I've been teaching. This is my second year teaching a Bonhoeffer seminar at Duke. I've been doing some work on Barth and was able to sort of maybe publish a couple things, trying to do a rereading of Barth that pulls him inside of these questions of coloniality and imperialism by way of a kind of conversation with Du Bois. And in this project, what is interesting to me is Bonhoeffer's situatedns in these matters. Bonhoeffer is very interesting, a very interesting figure, precisely because, in the way I teach the course at least, and let me just summarize here, because I'm not going to be able to go through it. I'll be better if I step away. The way that I teach the course, and the way in which I've written this out here, is I try to suggest a kind of geographical imagination. Do I need to say that?
That'd be awesome.
Okay.
You can pick it up.
Good.
Oh, this one, you can use this one. This one's for the portable mic, right?
Cool. Thank you very much. What I do in the course, and what I start to try and shape up here and begin to give the light of day to, is to read Bonhoeffer in spatial terms. Read him spatially, geographically, and read him in relationship to ultimately the Black Atlantic. And I begin by talking about how Bonhoeffer, in his own personhood, as it were, he begins to his life is a rehearsal of the very itinerary, the spatial itinerary of modernity. Right? He begins as a theology student, I believe, in Tübingen, and during this time when he's studying theology, he takes a trip into the Mediterranean, goes to Rome, right? And then from the Mediterranean, he comes back to Berlin, and then he goes to Barcelona, Spain. This is very important because in many ways, that very spatial trajectory is already the beginnings of traveling again the circuitry of how Europe becomes this thing we call Europe. Begins in the Mediterranean, culminates in the Iberian Peninsula, out of which the Atlantic Circuit opens up, and imperialism, modern imperialism as we know it, comes online. Bonhoeffer literally retraces that circuitry. He then goes back to Berlin, and then after he makes that last trip back to Berlin, then he goes into the Atlantic, the Black Atlantic, and comes to New York City. And New York City can be split between sort of like, and you know all of this, my friend. New York City can be split between his time at Union's Theological Seminary, but also what I call his underground time, when he was in Harlem. And Harlem is very important because in 1930s Harlem, when he is there, what we now call the Harlem Renaissance, the New Negro Renaissance, was bustling. We know that Bonhoeffer read extensively in much of the Harlem Renaissance literature. I'll make a claim in the course that it was this reading of this literature that I believe began to open up his imagination to what was at stake in the Jewish problem. But he had to be routed through the circuitry of the Black Atlantic. Not only did he spend time in New York City, in Harlem, but between semesters, he goes to what I call like the philosophical center of the New Negro Renaissance. That is to say, he goes to Howard University. He connects up with people like Alan Locke and the intellectual work that's happening in Howard. He goes back to New York City. No, before he goes back to New York City, he actually spends a little bit of time in Cuba, interestingly. Now he's in the Antilles. He comes back to New York City. He finishes his time at Union, but before he goes back to Europe, he goes, alas, to Mexico. This is very interesting. All of this interesting spatial movement is interesting when you track his intellectual development as well. By the time he gets back to Europe and to Berlin to commence teaching, Bonhoeffer has put a new accent on his deep interest in Christology. Prior to this time, Christology in many ways, it was a groundbreaking Christology, but still prior to this time, Christology at the end of the day did not break and interrupt national subjectivity, what it meant to be a German national. It didn't interrupt that. By the time he comes back, things are a little different here. He now wants to imagine a Christ that interrupts all of this stuff. In other words, Bonhoeffer has come to the core of the Christological problem as well, just as Césaire has. And he's trying to rework how we think who Jesus is. Now, what I was going to focus on, if I had time, was some important essays in this book, The Ethics. This is a powerful book. It's powerful both for what it accomplishes, but it's also powerful because I think it also discloses the grip, the degree to which the grip of a certain Christological imagination, the imagination of Christianity with the West, remains tenacious even for Bonhoeffer. I'm thinking particularly of the second essay in the book, which is Ethics as Formation. It's a powerful piece. He talks about what it means to be formed in the image of Jesus Christ, what it means to be conformed to Christ, Christ's embracing of all humankind. But by the time he gets to the end of what I think is an otherwise very powerful theological meditation, the very final paragraphs tell the story, though. It becomes clear in those closing paragraphs that the historical manifestation of those peoples in the world that has most borne the form of Christ is the West. He is explicit on this. It is still the West. He wants to renew the West. So he goes from there into the following chapter on heritage and decay. And heritage and decay, in many ways, is a scary meditation. It's a powerful meditation, but it's a scary meditation. It's all the more scary coming from Bonhoeffer, because we know Bonhoeffer's energy and his desire to renew Christianity. But in heritage and decay, you see the degree to which he's still captured by it. What do I mean by this? The story of heritage and decay is a story that leaps off in many ways from Hegel. He buys the Hegelian narrative of history. There are historical peoples and there are unhistorical peoples, right? Of course, we know in Hegel's narrative, Africa doesn't enter into history. The Far East, the peoples of the Asian East, history has already left them. It has passed from the East. It has moved, its present moment is in the West, and the Americas is of a history that is yet to come. They are unrealized history. The historical now is Europe. That's the historical now. Bonhoeffer buys that narrative. His problem is this. He sees that it's that narrative of unity comes to realize itself because the peoples of the West are the peoples of Christ. He keeps, in other words, the equation between Europe and Christ, even as he's trying to break it a little bit. In fact, in that text, he's not really trying to break it. What he's trying to do is resuscitate it, because he sees that what the war is doing, the war is breaking the Catholicity of the Western world. The West is fighting each other. We've got Germans fighting French. We've got the British now coming over here, getting ready to fight us. We've got people in the U.S. getting ready to come and fight. And what you see is a kind of intramural conflict. And the reason Bonhoeffer basically argues for this intramural conflict is because we are decaying from our heritage. What is our heritage? Our heritage is that we are the bearers of the form of Christ historically. That's heritage and decay. Now, here's the good news about Bonhoeffer. What I love about him is that he was always wrestling with himself. So by the time I think you get to the letters and papers from in prison, he's trying to, again, pull this connection apart between the West and Christ. My claim is this. There are a lot of people out there who argue about what religionless Christianity means in Bonhoeffer. Given the kind of work that I'm doing, and I hope the kind of historical context and setting up that I'm doing, I'm trying to sustain an argument to say the stakes in religionless Christianity is not the viability of a secularized version of Christianity versus an unsecularized version. Religionless Christianity, I think Bonhoeffer is groping to target the way in which Western man, as homo religiosus, got collapsed into Christian man, European man. And he wants to pull that apart. Religionless is the effort to name pulling it apart. And at that point, he now is trying to reopen the question of the identity of Jesus in relationship to the identity of humankind. Now, if that Christological argument holds, the kind of rereading of Christology I'm suggesting holds here, I can now come back to Césaire of this text, Notebook of a Return to the Native Land. Why? Because this poetic text, I don't know how many times I've read this, and every time I read it, it's like, do I really understand this text? It's a powerful text, but I admit I'm still trying to get my mind around so many aspects of it. It's very interesting, nevertheless, though, that the text opens by describing the situation of Martinique as bearing an unbearable weight. Remember, he used the language of weight earlier. He calls it the geometrical weight of the cross. And here, again, I want to give it specific historical context. I want to suggest that what Césaire is, again, pushing on is the ways in which the Western world, through imperialism, through its colonialism and racism to sustain the imperial world, has imagined itself as the bearer of redemption in relationship to those who don't have God, the savage, the barbaric. What is Martinique? What is the Antilles? What is blackness? Blackness is that which has been constructed to bear this eternal weight of damnation. I want to contend that a person like Frantz Fanon, also from Martinique and a student of Aimé Césaire, he calls this weight put on blackness a figure configured to be homo damnatus, the wretched of the earth. The wretched of the earth is a negative religious figure in relationship to the Western world that reads itself as a positive religious figure. By the time we get to the end of this text, Césaire locates us on the slave ship. Talk about memory again. He brings us back to the slave ship, and he wants to imagine a kind of uprising on the slave ship, a kind of resurrection on the slave ship. The slaves who were once interred in the hull of the ship, Christologically almost, they resurrect, come to the top of the ship, and you get this kind of movement of a kind of descent and now a kind of resurrection. And I think, at least the way I want to suggest around this text, is that Césaire poetically is trying to rewrite the terms at the level of the imagination of how a certain vision of the God-man has informed the way in which Western coloniality and so forth works. And so what does all this mean? What this finally all means is that theologically, after the Holocaust, I want to suggest that the stakes are exactly how we understand what the human is, but understand that the question of the human is also the question of the striving among the West to divinize itself and the ways in which it mobilized Christian theology and Christian theological discourses to do that work. The question is, what does it mean to separate that? I think like a person like Césaire gives us a hint. It would mean something along the lines of this, that the life of the one we call Jesus, who's the Savior of the world, we get a clue about that life not by looking at the world of Western hegemony, but actually looking at those who are on the slave ship. We've got to actually recenter our gaze. We must look between the slave ship, and I think by implication of what he's saying, we must look inside of the gas chamber, back to the Holocaust. It's in those spaces that God articulates God's self, but articulates God's self, and again, I want to stay with Césaire, in a way that there's a moment of resistance, a moment of possibility right inside of the space of suffering. He reads, in other words, the slave ship and the suffering of the slave ship as not final. As he says throughout the text, we stand, we arise. So that's more or less where I was going. That's a summary of the last moves. Okay? Thank you very much.